Well, a viewer contacted City Limits recently with concerns that as Bloomington grows and changes, people with disabilities are being left behind or forgotten by their community. In light of this concern, Benta Boutier looked into what efforts the city makes and if people living with disabilities perceive these efforts as sufficient.
In the downtown area, David Carter talks about the ways Bloomington has changed for people living with disabilities in the last 30 years. Carter is a longtime member of Bloomington's Council for Community Accessibility.
Yeah, well, I joined after I was no longer standing. I'm a sitting member in good standing.
He's used a wheelchair for 44 years. Carter says that though there are always more improvements to be made, Bloomington was ahead of the curve in making the community more accessible for people living with disabilities since the ADA was passed in 1990. He says more ramps, curb cuts, and handicap parking spots have been added in heavily trafficked areas like downtown. Making progress wasn't straightforward at first.
To learn a new trade, which is to put curb ramps, which is the technical name for curb cuts, in sidewalks was a new thing for them, and they had to learn how to do that. And left to their own devices, they would just do it the old way, which did not include curb cuts.
But he says as time's gone on, things have improved and the relationship between the city and Council for Community Accessibility became more collaborative. Michael Shermis is the Special Projects Coordinator for the city's Community and Family Resources Department and is the staff liaison for the Council for Community Accessibility. He agrees with Carter that the city has many things they need to improve for people living with disabilities, but he says that the city takes care to respond to people's requests for improvement quickly. Shermis shows us one of the areas the city repaired recently for better wheelchair access.
Just a few days ago, when you came down off of this grade onto this alleyway here, it had been all bumpy and torn up and broken pieces of asphalt. And when a wheelchair were to go off onto that, it would like be really difficult and hard to lift up and go over. We put in a report about it, and they immediately came and put an asphalt on it, and the grade is now smooth. Maybe David would care to just drive down and show us. And there you go, nice and smooth.
He says that the city makes efforts to make the town more accessible that don't always meet the needs of people living with disabilities.
It has a meter that has an accessible symbol on it, but when you look to see the actual space itself, you realize that if somebody parks here, if they need to try to get out, they can't get out onto the curb. They have to get out into the street. They have to roll up into the street to the nearest place where there's a curb cut and come back down and all the way down to get to the meter.
He and Carter then demonstrate what an ideal accessible spot looks like.
When you park into it, you don't need a full-blown access aisle beyond it because it goes right onto the sidewalk, and the sidewalk in essence split up so that enables him to get out real easily and be able to turn and move right up onto the sidewalk with not that big of a grade. He can go either way.
Carter says accessible transportation, ramps, and parking are just a few of the things that affect people living with disabilities. And to make sure no one is left out as the city progresses, people living with disabilities need to be at the forefront of change. For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Benta Boutier.